The wrench slipped from Jace Morin's oil-stained fingers, clattering against the metal floor of his workshop with a sharp ring that echoed through the empty corridors beyond. He cursed softly, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, leaving a streak of grease across his skin. The fusion reactor housing he'd been repairing for the past 3 hours remained stubbornly sealed, its access panel warped from years of thermal stress and neglect. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal remains of mining station Kether 7, carrying with it the bite of an approaching storm. The structure groaned and settled around him, metal contracting in the dropping temperature. Jace had grown accustomed to these sounds over the past 2 years, the symphony of a dying outpost that refused to fully surrender to the void. He straightened his back, joints protesting after hours bent over machinery, and glanced at the chronometer mounted on the wall. 1840 local time. Another day bleeding into night in this forgotten corner of the galaxy, where time moved differently, and hope had long since packed its bags and caught the last transport out. Jace Morin hadn't meant to stay this long. Originally part of a maintenance crew sent to decommission the station's critical systems, he'd volunteered to remain behind for the final shutdown sequence. That was supposed to take 3 weeks. Somehow, those weeks had stretched into months and years. The Colonial Authority had stopped sending supply drops after the first year, assuming the station was fully abandoned. They weren't entirely wrong. Jace was the only soul left on a facility built to house 3,000. But he'd found something here in the silence, something he hadn't expected. Peace, perhaps, or maybe just the absence of demands. No schedules to keep, no supervisors breathing down his neck, no crowds pressing in from all sides. Just him, the machines, and the endless task of keeping the lights on. His workshop occupied what had once been the station's secondary maintenance bay. The space was larger than any apartment he'd ever afforded back on the core worlds, and he'd made it comfortable in his own way. A cot in one corner, a small cooking unit beside a water recycler, shelves lined with salvaged parts and half-finished projects. The air smelled of metal polish and synthetic lubricants, familiar scents that had become the aromatics of home. The storm struck with sudden violence, battering the outer hull with debris and ice. Jace could hear the atmospheric processors straining to maintain pressure as the weather system tore at the station's exposed sections. He'd weathered dozens of these storms, but they never failed to remind him how fragile his sanctuary really was. He was preparing to shut down the workshop for the night when the sound reached him. 3 soft knocks against the outer door, barely audible above the wind. Jace froze, his hand halfway to the power switch for his workbench. Knocking was impossible. No one knew he was here. No ships had landed in 8 months. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Moving carefully, Jace retrieved the plasma cutter from his tool belt and approached the door. The external camera showed only static and swirling snow. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the manual release. Opening the door would flood his workshop with freezing air and potentially compromise his environmental systems. But something in those gentle knocks spoke of desperation rather than threat. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and she fell into his arms. Her body was slight, trembling, and impossibly cold against his chest. Jace caught her instinctively, his tools clattering to the floor as he wrapped his arms around her too. Keep them both upright. She was conscious, but barely, her eyes fluttering as she struggled to focus on his face. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I can work. I can help. Just don't turn me away." Jace stared down at her, his mind reeling. She was clearly not human. Her skin held a pale blue undertone that seemed to shimmer in the workshop's lighting, and her hair was an unusual silver white that caught the light like spun metal. But it was her eyes that struck him most. Large, intelligent, and filled with a fear so deep it made his chest tighten. "What are you doing out there?" He managed, though the question felt inadequate. "How did you even find this place?" "Followed the power signatures," she said, her words coming in short gasps. "Saw your lights from the ridge. Been walking for days." Jace made a decision. He pulled her fully inside and sealed the door behind them, immediately feeling the workshop's heating system strain to compensate for the lost warmth. She was wearing what looked like the remnants of a service uniform, torn and stained, offering little protection against the brutal cold outside. "You're hypothermic," he said, guiding her toward the heating unit. "Sit here. Don't move." He grabbed every thermal blanket he owned, wrapping them around her shaking form before cranking the heater to maximum output. Her lips were blue, breathing shallow and rapid. Jace had seen hypothermia before, during his early years working orbital construction. She was close to the edge. "What's your name?" he asked, preparing a heat pack and sliding it under the blankets against her back. "Naya," she replied, her voice growing slightly stronger as warmth began to seep back into her body. "And you're Jace Morin, senior maintenance technician. Transferred from the Harwell Yards 18 months ago." Jace froze. "How do you know?" "That? I read your work logs," she said, managing a weak smile. "Your maintenance records are scattered all over the station's data networks. You're very thorough." Despite everything, Jace found himself almost smiling in return. "You've been monitoring the station?" "For weeks, trying to figure out if it was safe to approach." Naya pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "I needed somewhere to hide, somewhere off the shipping routes. This place doesn't officially exist anymore." "Hide from what?" Naya's expression darkened. "Slavers. Trafficking syndicate. I was property until 6 days ago." The words hit Jace like a physical blow. He'd heard about the syndicates, of course. Everyone had. But hearing it spoken so matter-of-factly by someone sitting in his workshop made it real in a way that news reports never could. "You escaped?" "Killed 2 guards and stole a shuttle," she said without emotion. "Crashed it about 15 kilometers from here. Been walking since." Jace stared at her, this small, fragile-looking woman who had somehow survived 6 days in the wilderness after escaping what amounted to organized hell. There was steel beneath her exhaustion, a core of strength that spoke of someone who had endured more than any person should have to. "They'll be looking for you," he said. "Yes, if they find you here... They'll kill us both." Naya met his eyes directly. "I know what I'm asking. If you want me to leave, I understand." Jace was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm. Rage outside. He thought about his empty years on this station, the comfortable solitude he'd built around himself like armor. He thought about the woman who had shared his name and his bed back when the galaxy had seemed smaller and more forgiving. He thought about the choice between safety and humanity. "You're not going anywhere tonight," he said finally. "Storm won't break until morning, and you'd be dead within an hour out there." Relief flooded Naya's features. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jace replied, already calculating what this decision might cost them both. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." As the night deepened around them, Jace found himself studying this unexpected visitor. Naya had fallen asleep sitting up, her head tilted against the wall, silver hair catching the workshop's amber lighting. Even in sleep, she remained alert, her breathing careful and controlled. For the first time in 2 years, Jace Morin was not alone. For the first time in longer than that, he found himself caring about someone else's survival more than his own comfort. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, as he settled onto his own cot across the room, listening to the gentle rhythm of Naya's breathing beneath the storm's fury, Jace discovered something he'd thought lost forever. He discovered that he was still capable of hope. Outside, The wind continued its assault on the dying station. But inside the workshop, two souls had found unexpected shelter, not just from the storm, but from the loneliness that had been consuming them both, one day at a time, until this moment when their separate paths had converged in the most unlikely of places. Tomorrow would bring decisions and dangers, but tonight they were simply two people sharing warmth in the vast cold of space. Neither of them alone anymore. The medical bay's emergency lighting cast everything in a pale blue glow, making the abandoned space feel more like a tomb than a place of healing. Davin Cross moved through the familiar rows of empty beds, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. Most of the equipment had been stripped away when the station was decommissioned, but he'd managed to salvage enough to maintain a basic treatment facility. Not that anyone needed it anymore. Davin had been the station's head medic during its final operational year, watching the population dwindle as families and workers departed on weekly transports. He'd stayed behind ostensibly to oversee the medical equipment transfer, but as the months passed and the paperwork grew less urgent, he'd simply remained. The medical bay had become his refuge, a place where his skills still mattered, even if no one was left to treat. At 38, Davin was younger than most of his former colleagues, but years of frontier medicine had carved lines around his eyes and streaked his dark hair with premature silver. His hands, surgeon steady and gentle, were perhaps his most defining feature, instruments of healing that had saved hundreds of lives across a dozen worlds. The storm raging outside made the station's hull sing with metallic harmonies. Davin was inventorying his remaining medical supplies when the proximity alarm chimed softly. He looked up from his tablet, frowning. The sensor grid around the medical section was more sensitive than other areas of the station, designed to detect incoming casualties during the facility's operational days. He pulled up the external feed on his workstation, squinting at the grainy image. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a figure moving slowly along the outer walkway, hunched against the wind. Someone was out there, struggling through conditions that should have been lethal. Davin grabbed his emergency kit and thermal coat, rushing through the medical bay's airlocks toward the external access port. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside, wind driving ice crystals against his exposed skin. Through the storm, he could see her more clearly now. A woman stumbling along the walkway, one hand pressed against the wall for support. "Over here," he called, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "This way." She turned toward his voice, and even through the storm, he could see that something was wrong. Her gait was uneven, favoring her left side, and dark stains marked her clothing. Blood, he realized with professional clarity. She was injured. Myra collapsed just as she reached the medical bay's entrance, her legs giving out from exhaustion and blood loss. Davin caught her before she hit the ground, immediately assessing her condition even as he carried her inside. Human mid-20s, multiple lacerations on her right arm and torso, possible internal injuries, severe dehydration and exposure. "Stay with me," he murmured, laying her gently on the nearest examination table. "You're safe now." "I'm a doctor." Her eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises flecked with gold. Not a doctor," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Ran away from doctors." Davin paused in his preparation of medical supplies. "I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm here to help, not hurt." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she relaxed slightly against the examination table. As Davin began cleaning her wounds, he noticed the precise nature of the cuts on her arm. These weren't accidental injuries. They were too clean, too deliberately placed. "Someone did this to you," he said quietly, his hands working with practiced efficiency to close the deeper lacerations. Myra didn't answer immediately, but her breathing quickened. "Research facility," she finally admitted. "Medical experiments." I was a test subject. Davin's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. He'd heard rumors about illegal research operations in the outer systems, places where desperate people were used as guinea pigs for untested treatments and procedures. The thought made him sick. What kind of experiments? Neural interface trials. They were trying to enhance cognitive function through direct brain stimulation. Myra's voice was flat, clinical. The early subjects ... didn't survive. I was lucky. Batch 7. Davin finished suturing her arm and moved to examine her other injuries. How long were you there? 8 months. Escaped during a power failure 3 days ago. She winced as he probed a particularly tender spot on her ribs. Been walking since. Saw your lights. You walked for 3 days with these injuries? Had to. They used tracking implants. Had to get far enough away to remove it myself. She gestured weakly toward a small, healing incision at the base of her neck. Davin's admiration for this woman's strength grew with each detail. To survive what she'd endured, then escape and perform surgery on herself. It spoke to a resilience he rarely encountered, even in his years treating trauma patients. You did a good job, he said, examining the incision site. Clean cuts, proper cauterization. Where did you learn field surgery? Watched the researchers work, Myra replied. 8 months of observation teaches you things. As Davin continued his examination, he found himself drawn to more than just Myra's medical needs. There was something in her eyes, a depth that spoke, of intelligence and curiosity undimmed by her ordeal. When she asked questions about his equipment or procedures, her inquiries were sharp and informed. You're not just a test subject, he observed, applying a healing gel to her smaller cuts. You have medical training. Myra hesitated. Pre-med student. Before they took me, I was studying xenobiology at the tertiary university on Calder's Prime. What happened? Wrong place, wrong time. Debt collectors came for my roommate, grabbed me instead. Her voice carried no self-pity, just tired acceptance. Sold me to cover someone else's gambling problem. Davin felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate. He'd seen the aftermath of trafficking operations before, but hearing it described so matter-of-factly by someone sitting on his examination table made it personal in a way that surprised him. Well, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, you're not property anymore. You're a person who needs medical care, and that's all that matters in here. Myra's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected such simple acceptance. You don't know what they'll do if they find me. What they'll do to you for helping. Let me worry about that. Davin finished his treatment and stepped back. Right now, you need rest, nutrition, and time to heal. Everything else can wait. He prepared a sleeping alcove in the recovery section, a small room adjacent to the main medical bay. The bed was standard medical issue, narrow but comfortable, with monitoring equipment he could use to track her vital signs while she slept. I can work, Myra said as he helped her settle into the bed. I know medical procedures, equipment maintenance. I can earn my keep. You're not here to work, Davin replied, pulling a thermal blanket over her. You're here to recover. Then why are you helping me? Davin considered the question. Why was he helping her? The practical answer was simple. He was a doctor, and she was injured. But the deeper truth was more complicated. In the 2 years since the station's abandonment, he'd begun to feel like a ghost haunting the empty corridors, useful only to machines that needed repair. Myra's arrival had reminded him of his primary purpose, healing people, not just maintaining equipment. Because this is what doctors do, he said finally. We heal. Myra studied his face in the dim light. What's a doctor doing alone on hand? Abandoned station? Someone has to keep the medical bay operational, Davin replied. Just in case. In case of what? Davin looked around the empty facility, then back at her. In case someone shows up who needs help. Understanding passed. Between them, silent but profound. Myra had wandered through the storm-seeking shelter, and Davin had been waiting without knowing it, maintaining his post for a patient who might never come. Their meeting felt less like coincidence than like the universe correcting some fundamental imbalance. As Myra drifted off to sleep, Davin settled into the monitoring station beside her bed. He told himself he was just being thorough, watching for signs of infection or complications from her injuries. But the truth was simpler and more complex. For the first time in years, he had someone to care for again. Through the medical bay's small windows, the storm continued its assault on the station's hull. But inside, surrounded by the quiet hum of life support systems and the steady rhythm of Myra's breathing, Davin Cross felt something he'd almost forgotten. Purpose, connection, the beginning of something that might, given time and care, grow into love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations. But tonight, doctor and patient rested peacefully, no longer quite so, alone in the vast emptiness of space. The fusion core's harmonic resonance had been off by 0.03% for the past week, and it was driving Quinn Steele absolutely mad. She crouched in the reactor chamber's access tunnel, her diagnostic tablet glowing in the cramped space, watching readouts that should have been perfectly synchronized dance chaotically across the screen. The variance was small enough that most engineers would have ignored it, but Quinn wasn't most engineers. She'd been the station's chief systems engineer for 5 years before the evacuation, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance of power, atmosphere, and gravity that kept 3,000 people alive in the void. When the Colonial Authority ordered the shutdown, Quinn had volunteered to oversee the reactor's safe decommission. Like the others who'd stayed behind, her temporary assignment had become permanent through a combination of bureaucratic oversight and personal choice. The engineering section occupied the station's heart, a maze of conduits, control rooms, and reactor chambers that stretched across 3 levels. Quinn had made her home in the primary control center, surrounding herself with screens and readouts that painted a complete picture of the station's health. Here, she was connected to every system, every circuit, every breath the dying facility. Took dot at 34. Quinn was tall and lean, with short auburn hair that perpetually escaped whatever clips or bands she used to contain it. Her hands were always stained with coolant or marked with small burns from working on live systems. She preferred the company of machines to people. Machines were logical, predictable, honest about their failures. The harmonic variance spiked. Again, and Quinn's frown deepened. She was reaching for a calibration tool when the lights flickered. Not a power surge. She would have detected that immediately. This was something else. A drain on the system that didn't match any known operational parameters. Pulled up the station's power distribution grid on her tablet. Their Section 7 Delta, the old civilian quarters. Someone was drawing power from the emergency lighting circuits. Unauthorized access to her systems. She grabbed her toolkit and headed for the transit tube, her mind already cataloging possible explanations. Scavengers sometimes broke into abandoned facilities, but they usually targeted valuable equipment rather than basic utilities. This felt different, more careful, like someone trying to avoid detection while meeting basic survival needs. The civilian section had been empty for 18 months, its corridors dark, except for the minimal emergency lighting Quinn maintained throughout the station. She followed the power signature to residential Block C, where her readings indicated someone had tapped into the heating grid. Quinn approached apartment C47 cautiously, her diagnostic scanner in one hand, plasma torch in the other. The door was sealed, but someone had jury-rigged a power coupling to the corridor's emergency systems. The work was crude, but effective. Exactly the kind of field modification someone without proper tools might attempt. She knocked twice on the door panel. "This is a restricted area," she called. "You're drawing unauthorized power from critical systems." Silence. Then, after a long moment, the door slid open partially. The woman who peered out was perhaps 28, with dark hair pulled back. In a practical ponytail and intelligent green eyes that immediately focused on Quinn's toolkit. She was human, wearing salvaged clothing that had been modified for warmth, and she carried herself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to making herself small. "I'm sorry," the woman said quickly. "I didn't think anyone would notice. I can disconnect it. How long have you been here?" Quinn asked, surprised by her own lack of anger. The unauthorized modification should have irritated her, but the woman's obvious technical skill was impressive. 4 days. "I know I shouldn't be here, but the storm. You've been living in an unheated apartment for 4 days?" Quinn interrupted. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" The woman's expression grew defensive. "I rigged a heating element. It's safe." "Safe?" Quinn pushed past her into the apartment, her engineer's eye immediately cataloging the modifications. "You've overloaded 3 separate circuits, created a fire hazard, and—" She stopped mid-sentence, staring at the makeshift heating system. "Actually, this is pretty clever." The woman had used salvaged components to create a small but efficient heating unit, carefully balancing power draw to avoid triggering the station's safety protocols. The work showed real understanding of electrical systems and thermal dynamics. "What's your name?" Quinn asked. "Vera." "Vera Santos." "Where did you learn to do this kind of work, Vera?" Vera hesitated. "Cargo transport engineering. Worked the freight runs between the inner colonies before ... double quotes." She trailed off. "Before what?" "Before I made some bad choices and ended up running from people who don't forgive debts." Quinn recognized the pattern. Another refugee, another person who'd found their way to this forgotten corner of space, seeking sanctuary. She thought about reporting the unauthorized presence to whom? There was no authority here anymore, no protocol for handling stowaways on an abandoned station. "Your power coupling is going to fail within the next 6 hours, Quinn said instead. "The connections aren't rated for continuous load." Vera's face fell. "I can try to fix it. No need." Quinn pulled a proper power coupling from her toolkit. "We'll do it right." For the next hour, they worked together upgrading Vera's crude but ingenious heating system. Quinn found herself impressed by Vera's intuitive understanding of engineering principles. She asked intelligent questions, anticipated needs, and caught potential problems before Quinn had to point them out. "You're wasted on cargo transport," Quinn observed as they tested the new connections. "This kind of systems thinking. You could have been an engineer. Couldn't afford the certification programs?" Vera replied, coiling excess cable with practiced efficiency. "Cargo work paid better than apprenticeships." "What kind of debt are you running from?" Vera's hands stilled. "Gambling." "Not mine. My partner's." She accumulated about 40,000 credits in obligations before disappearing. "I was listed as a co-signer on her registration." She resumed coiling cable, her movements sharp with suppressed anger. "Woke up one morning to find enforcement contractors in my apartment." Quinn winced. Debt enforcement in the outer systems was notoriously brutal, operating in legal gray areas where creditors had broad authority to recover losses. Vera's flight made perfect sense. "How did you end up here?" "Stole a maintenance pod from the freight depot where I worked. Automated navigation brought me to the nearest waypoint, which happened to be this place." Vera managed a wry smile. "Lucky me." They finished the installation as the storm reached its peak intensity outside. The apartment was now properly heated, warm enough to be comfortable rather than merely survivable. Quinn found herself reluctant to leave, drawn by Vera's combination of technical competence and quiet resilience. "You can't stay here," Quinn said finally. "This section isn't properly sealed for long-term habitation. Atmospheric recyclers are offline. Water systems are dormant. Where am I supposed to go?" Vera asked, though her tone held resignation rather than anger. Quinn surprised herself with her answer. "Engineering section. I've got full life support, redundant systems, proper quarters." Vera stared at her. "You're offering to let me stay with you?" "I'm offering to let you stay in a section of the station that won't kill you." Quinn's practical tone didn't quite hide the warmth beneath. "There's plenty of space, and honestly, it would be nice to have someone around who understands which end of a plasma cutter to hold." The walk back to engineering took 20 minutes through corridors that groaned under the storm's assault. Quinn found herself stealing glances at Vera, noting how she automatically assessed the structural integrity of each section they passed, her engineer's eye cataloging stress points and potential failures. The engineering section felt different, with Vera in it. Quinn's carefully organized workspace suddenly seemed sparse and utilitarian, designed for function rather than comfort. She showed Vera to a small but well-appointed quarters adjacent to the main control room, complete with proper bedding, environmental controls, and a small food preparation area. "This is more than I expected," Vera said, running her hand along the clean walls. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Quinn replied, echoing Jace's words from 2 levels above. "We haven't figured out the long-term situation." But as they settled into the control room, sharing a simple meal while monitoring the station systems, Quinn realized she didn't want to figure out the long-term situation. Not if it meant Vera leaving. They worked late into the night, with Vera proving herself invaluable as an assistant. She learned Quinn's systems quickly, anticipated needs, and offered suggestions that showed real insight into the station's engineering challenges. More than that, she listened when Quinn explained complex procedures, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in the elegant solutions that kept their small corner of the universe habitable. "Why did you stay?" Vera asked, as they performed the nightly shutdown sequence. "After everyone else left?" Quinn paused, considering how to answer. "Someone needs to keep the lights on. These systems are too complex to just abandon. Without maintenance, the reactor could destabilize, potentially damage other installations in the system." "That's the official reason? What's the real one?" Vera's directness caught Quinn off guard. Most people accepted surface explanations, but Vera saw through to the heart of things with uncomfortable accuracy. "I was good at my job," Quinn said finally. "Really good. Out here, that still matters. Back in the core systems, I was just another engineer in a pool of thousands. Here, I'm essential. Lonely, though. Loneliness is better than irrelevance." Vera was quiet for a long moment. "I understand," she said. "On the cargo runs, I was just crew, expendable, but the ships needed me to function. Without proper engineering support, those routes would have been impossible." They sat together in the control room as the storm gradually weakened outside. Quinn monitored her readouts while Vera familiarized herself with the secondary systems. The silence between them was comfortable, the quiet of 2 technical minds working in harmony. "Vera," Quinn said as they prepared to sleep, "that heating system you built in C-47, it was actually brilliant. Crude materials, but the thermal efficiency calculations were spot on." Vera smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure Quinn had seen from her. "Thank you." It felt good to build something again, instead of just maintaining someone else's work. As they settled into their respective quarters, Quinn realized that for the first time since the evacuation, the engineering section felt alive again. Not just functional, but purposeful. Vera's presence had reminded her that maintaining systems wasn't just about keeping Machines running. It was about creating spaces where life could flourish. In the morning, Quinn thought, they would need to address practical concerns. Food, supplies, long-term quarters, the question of Vera's legal status. But tonight, listening to the gentle hum of perfectly balanced systems, and knowing that someone else appreciated the delicate engineering that made life possible, Quinn Steele felt something she'd almost forgotten, the joy of sharing her expertise with someone who truly understood its value. The station's heart beat steady and strong around them, and for the first time in months, Quinn's own heart seemed to find its rhythm as well.